We're going to return to UV Texture Editor and discuss some more basic functionality and how you can relate it to what you see in the view panel. So for this video, I brought in a polygon primitive sphere. So we're going to start simple and work our way up. Because it's a primitive, it was given a valid set of UV points right off the bat. So if I go to UV Texture Editor, under Window, UV Texture Editor, here's what I see. Now, even though it looks like a sphere, it's been laid flat. So basically all surfaces are laid flat like a map. Like you take the globe and lay it flat into a map. Now sometimes some of the faces and edges might overlap and you have to deal with that, and we'll discuss that in further detail. But ultimately everything gets flattened out in this UV texture space. It is a 2D space. In fact, if you look at the grid closely, you can see that there's values here running from 0 to 1 in both these directions, left, right, up, down. The bottom left is 0, 0. What happens is U, as in the U direction, runs left to right from 0 to 1. V, or the V direction, runs from 0 to 1 going down to up. So UVs refers to U and V direction, U direction, V direction. So it's a 2D space. Although nothing's overlapping here, that's one problem that might arise. So again, in here you'll see the edges and faces of the surface. So you'll notice that at the top of this space that there's kind of a sawtooth, jaggy set of faces up here. And those faces are actually at the top and bottom of the sphere, where the sphere pinches into the pole. One's the top, one's the bottom. So how do you relate what you see here to what you see in the 3D view? Well, you can make a selection in your view panel and see it in the UV Texture Editor and vice versa. For example, if I go back to my view panel, right mouse key, and select face, and pick a face, that face will be isolated inside the UV Texture Editor, so you can see where that face lies in the UV Texture Editor. So this particular face is roughly at 0.1 in U and roughly 0.9 in V. So its UV coordinates would be roughly 0.1, 0.9. At least one of its corners would be. I can make more than one selection if I pick a whole bunch of faces. You'll see all those faces appear in the editor. This selection is only temporary. If I click off, they go away and you'll see the entire surface. You can also choose edges. If I pick an edge or more than one edge, pick several edges here, you'll see all the edges appear so you can see where they are. You can also make selections from the UV Texture Editor itself. If you go to the UV Texture Editor, right mouse key, you have several options. You have edge. Once again, you can select edges right here in the editor. I selected the entire row, so there's those edges. You can also go back and choose faces. Like I can choose all these faces at the top. There they are. Click off or choose all the faces at the bottom. There they are. Click off. You can also choose vertices by switching the vertex there. So you can see when I select all the vertices at the very top along the sawtooth here, you can see how they share the same point up here at the top of the sphere. And that's an example of pinching, where all those points are pinched down to a single point in space. Even on the UV Texture Editor, they're flattened out and spread out. The other thing you can select through the right mouse menu here is UV. And UVs will look like vertices. If I pick a few of them, how do they function differently? You're not really going to see them in the view panel. You'll see them as green dots in the UV Texture Editor. And what you can do is actually move those around. Now we're going to talk about adjusting them in more detail, but just briefly what you can do is go grab your normal transform tools, like move, rotate, or scale, and move them here in this window. So for example, I'll just grab some UVs at this bottom corner here. Since I'm on the move tool, I can move them. Just freeform click drag them. Now as you do that, you'll notice that nothing happens on the sphere. The sphere is not being distorted. You're only moving the points. Again, the points relate pixels within the texture to vertices on the surface. The surface is not moved. You're simply telling the program to select a different part of that bitmap. For instance, I move these points from here at the corner, which means that set of faces will normally get the corner of that bitmap or procedural texture. If I move this set somewhere to like the middle, then that set of faces would get the central part of the bitmap or procedural texture. Here's a corner of the map, and here's the center. So you can move the UVs and edit the UVs inside the editor, affect this UV texture layout, which affects how the bitmap or procedural texture is going to be mapped to the object, but doesn't affect the actual geometry. Now, another way to examine this is to actually bring in a texture map and take a look at it. There's a way to display a texture map crudely in the view panel and also have it appear here inside UV Texture Editor so you can see how it relates. So I'm going to pick this as an object once again, and then I'm going to go to the Hypershade, and we'll assign a texture. Hypershade. I'm going to create a brand new blend material. Pick my sphere, assign it to the blend. Open up the blend's attribute editor by double-clicking. Go straight to color, go to the checkered map button, click that. The Create Render Node window opens. I can go get a texture. Now, in this case, one texture is useful for discussing UVs is the ramp. I'm going to go straight to the ramp and click the ramp button. And the ramp is mapped to that blend. I can pull nodes apart so you can see I have my blend, my ramp, and my Place 2D texture node. Again, the Place 2D texture node is in its default state when you create it. So if I look at its attribute editor, you can see the repeat UV is set to 1, 1. So that ramp is applied to the surface one time in both the U and V direction. So now it's assigned, what we can do is display it. So I'll pick the sphere again, hide the attribute editor by doing Control A. And notice that when I pick the sphere, select the sphere, that because it's assigned to a material that has a texture mapped to the color, that texture is automatically displayed in UV Texture Editor. And it doesn't matter what texture it is, it's going to be displayed here. Now, if you want to hide it, you can do that. There's a button up here at the top of the UV Texture Editor, has a little picture of a face. Turn it on or off to hide or show that texture. But you can see here how the red of the ramp's at the bottom, blue's at the top, and the green's in the center, and it runs down to up in terms of its direction. If I go back to the Hypershade, you'll see how that relates. So go ahead and go back to the blend, right mouse key, and graph network. And then I'll use my camera keys to get closer in the work area. And I'll make sure to go back and select my sphere again. And move the windows around so you can see everything here. What you can see is in the UV Texture Editor, the alignment of that texture is the same as the node in the Hypershade. And that's because when you look at the node in the Hypershade, the icon's displayed in such a fashion that U runs left to right across the bottom, and V runs down to up from the left corner. 0, 0 is in this corner. UV Texture Editor has the same layout. 0, 0 is down here. The U direction runs left to right on the bottom. V direction's down to up over here on the left. So for the V direction, 0 is down here, 1's up here. For the U direction, 0's here and 1's over here on the right. So the two relate to each other. Now, if I hide the Hypershade and go back to the sphere, I'll hide the UV Texture Editor 2 temporarily. I can also display a texture here without rendering. And this is often good for testing UVs. What I can do is go up to Shading, and assuming that Smooth Shade All is on, which it is, I can also go down to Hardware Texturing. If you activate Smooth Shade All and Hardware Texturing, what you'll get is a simplified version of the texture in the view panel. So I'll click Hardware Texturing, and there we go. And in fact, you'll see the ramp. Starts at red at the bottom, goes to green, goes to blue. And what does that mean? If I go back to UV Texture Editor, right off the bat, just looking at the two and comparing them, I now know that V starts at the bottom of the sphere and runs to the top. If you look at the UV Texture Editor, you can see that 0 and V, which is right here, is red. Therefore, 0 and V is right here on the sphere. I can see that 1 and V is at the top. Hence, 1 and V is at the top of the sphere. And based on the fact that the ramp runs from the bottom to the top, red, green to blue, I know that my V direction on the sphere runs upwards. It runs from pole to pole because I can see how it relates to the UV texture space. I know that U on the sphere runs across its circumference, in other words, across its waist right here, because U runs left to right here. And so if I look at 0.5 in V and look at U from 0 to 1, I see it's simply a green band. The green band here also runs in the same direction. So just by comparing the surface to the UV texture space, you can see right away how the UVs run. Again, in this case, V runs from the bottom pole to the top of the pole, or to the top pole, and U runs across the opposite direction, as if you're going around the equator. That's U direction. Now, it's possible the geometry might have been rotated or constructed in such a way that it doesn't come in with such an obvious correlation. Maybe if I was to rotate it like I just did and look at it in some funny manner, I can still tell what's going on. I can still tell that V runs from the red side to the blue side. Therefore, V runs from 0 down here to 1 up here, and U still runs across its center. And you can use this trick for any texture. If you had some other texture, you could see how the texture is aligned on the surface. Now, if the texture is simply noisy, like a marble or even actual noise texture, it might be difficult to tell what's going on. But with any kind of texture that has obvious differentiation in its colors, it should be easy to see what's happening here. And again, to see it inside the view panel, you have to just simply go to Smooth Shade All and Hardware Texturing to see that texture, assuming the texture is mapped to the color. So those are a few basics of the UV texture editor and how they relate to the surface. We're going to return to how to actually project UVs and edit them in more detail.